each of us is, intentionally or not, we are realizing some image of ourselves in the world. And I think this is the real value of an intentional investigation of what kind of future I wish to indwell. Because that future, if I invest seriously in the image of that future, it also has ethical obligations. It also gives me a course of action. And there are certain things that the guy who's dwelling in that future where I want to be, there are things that he doesn't do. So then when I, in the present, am confronted with those things, I then have a choice. Well, am I going to invest in that image, which might mean me suspending some habitual activity, or am I going to give in to a short-term craving, and even if it costs me that image?
Chandler Stevens, welcome back to the Evolve Move Play podcast. You've been on a couple of times, I believe, but I think it's been quite a while.
Yeah.
So I think it'd be good to just reintroduce you to the audience a little bit. So your main company now is Grounded Founder, right?
Yeah.
So you do therapeutic work and coaching work primarily with entrepreneurs. You and I have known each other for over a decade now, I believe.
It's a while.
Yeah. It's always funny to think about kind of the first time that I really remember. I think I'd maybe become Facebook friends, or I'd seen your name pop up. But the first time that I encountered you, you had written for an online strength conditioning magazine called Breaking Muscle.
Uh-huh.
And you had written an article about rough and tumble play, which is of course roughhousing, which is of course my big thing that one of the big things I was promoting through Evolve Move Play. And you were at the time associated with MoveNet, and I was like super pissed about that. Yeah. And so I was like, I don't know about this guy. He's young, up and comer, just trying to get into this space. And then you ended up working with Frank Ferencich, who's another mutual friend of ours and mentor, both of us in the play space. And yeah, you were definitely doing that. You came out and worked with me. You came out to one of my workshops in Indiana. But by then I think you were sort of like tacking away a little bit from movement as your primary interest, and you're digging into somatics, and eventually went to school for Jungian psychotherapy, which you're still in the middle of the dissertation, right?
Yeah, clinical psychology, Jungian influence, depth psychology broadly. Yeah.
And then I was having some health problems. I was having some fatigue issues and a lot of gut stuff. And you thought there might be an emotional component to it. And you offered to just start working with me, basically purely out of friendship, which we didn't really know each other that well. So it was a very, very generous thing that you did. And I was quite skeptical initially, like that. The research on the efficacy of talk therapy that I had looked into was pretty limited.
Mm-hmm.
And so we started, and I was kind of impatient, and I was like, when are we going to get, how do we know this is working? When is it going to work, et cetera? But you were patient with me, and it's just kind of like told me, keep going. But it took a while before we saw, it really started to pick up. And then it was, last year in the spring, I guess with the middle of winter, Beth asked for a separation, my wife, and that kicked off like a really deep healing journey. And so you helped see me through that, which was really profound. And we got to know each other quite a bit better through that process. We spent some time together in San Diego over a couple of weekends. I got to know more about your history and kind of how you'd been through this process. Mm-hmm. So for the audience, hopefully that's a good background into kind of the type of work you do and your evolution as a thinker. And so the first question I wanted to ask you is, you referred to what we did last year as a process of radical soul recovery. So what in the world is radical soul recovery? And what should the audience know about that?
Well, I hope the audience can look past what is often a very fluffy word, soul, and recognize that in the Western philosophical tradition, when we're talking about soul, we're actually pulling from very deep roots. This is something that goes back to Heraclitus as the first depth psychologist. He's sometimes called as the first person to link soul, psyche, with the quality of depth, and making the claim that the soul's depths are unfathomable. So what am I referring to if I say something like radical soul retrieval? I don't know if I use that exact phrase, but yeah, I mean, in hindsight, it would be that. So we made use of, I would say, a number of psychological technologies, one of which was psychedelics, but that I would not say is the crux of it. When I'm thinking about depth psychology, I take the word psychology very seriously through an etymological reversion that looks at psyche and logos. We are giving speech to the soul. And a good many of us, I would say as the default in Western modernity, we have lost the soul's perspective for a number of sociocultural reasons. Among those being the typical dualistic division between spirit and matter. And that leaves no place for the perspective of soul, which is an altogether different perspective. So this process of soul retrieval, let's say, is actually coming to experience oneself as a soul, not as an ego, not as a body, not as some transcendent spirit, but recognizing, I believe it was Wallace Stevens who wrote, it's easier to find a way beyond the world than a way through it. And this process of soul retrieval is really looking at how do we stay with the trouble of the world? How do we stay with the troubles of our lives rather than attempting to bypass them, transcend them? Certainly solve problems when they arise, but the soul has an innate relationship with suffering, which we could say more about later on. Hopefully that gives a general sense of what we're up to.
For some reason, the phrase that popped in my mind was that your work is attempting to de-psychologize the psyche.
It's, one of my primary theoretical influences is a guy named James Hillman, who wrote a book called Revisioning Psychology. And that's effectively what we're attempting to do in the archetypal psychological practice, is bring psyche back as psychology's focus, as opposed to what passes for psychology quite often is more like applied neurology or spiritualism dressed up as psychology. But it loses quality of psyche, which again is altogether different.
So soul, do you know what the etymological roots of soul is by any chance?
Soul, the English word? I'm not sure I do.
Yeah. Because psyche, I believe, also comes from breath, just like spirit and anima, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And many can obviously, a living human breathes and a dead human stops breathing. So in many cultures, there's this sort of association of the spirit with something like the wind, with something like, there's idea that vowels were not written in the Semitic languages because they represented something sacred, right? That we could capture the consonants. The breath itself could, we had to be careful about putting it down on paper, right? So I was curious if soul itself comes from that term, spirit, also respiration. So, I was listening to someone talking about motor learning, right? And he was saying he was a hard behaviorist, right? So he's rejecting the ecological approach because behaviorist. And I was like, oh wow, that's very old school behavior, because seems to be a largely failed paradigm, and its roots are so much sort of symptomatic of the way the scientific laboratory constrains how we can think, and then offers us a way of addressing the world that is tool-like, but that ends up in a very, Pavlov's rats or dogs, I think they were starved down to 70% of their body weight, right? Now you could entrain their behavior very, very easily through food. But when you have a healthy organism, it's actually much harder to get this sort of like simple conditioned stimulus response in the development of it. And yet there's a whole theory of human behavior that's sort of like everything is actually just iterated up off of this basic stimulus response relationship. And even the very sort of grounding of why we respond to stimulus in an aversive or appetitive way is in some sense not theoretically parsable or graspable using that lens. And yet that lens was used to remove the spirit from the psyche. Is kind of the way that I'm thinking about that. So tell me how that lands for you.
It is very interesting. I would say that, well, let's take soul as something like the imaginative possibility of our natures. And certainly the stimulus response model is a way that we as souls imagine ourselves. I can imagine myself as this classically conditioned organism trained to respond. The really interesting thing for me is, boy, what happens when I imagine myself such? What are the implications of that fantasy? And boy, if I am unaware of being in the grip of that fantasy, what are those implications? There are a number of different ways we imagine ourselves, and some of them are quite costly, and we don't know that we're paying those costs.
I've been reading a book called The Blind Side by Evan Thompson. I can't remember the other authors, but it's about how the scientific workshop is inherently dependent upon our conscious sensual experience of the world, and yet cannot turn itself inwards in some sense to that in a meaningful way, right? And so the analogy is like the eye cannot see that there's a blind spot in the center of the eye.
Yeah.
We see through the blind spot, but we can't see the blind spot. Mm-hmm. And the last time that we spoke, I believe we were talking about Morris Berman's book, The Reenchantment of the World, which is also about this idea that as powerful as science is, the technological, the experimental, materialist, technological worldview that arises from Bacon and Descartes somehow encloses our capacity to relate to the world in a way that has made us, in some sense, unwise or foolish. It has made us blind, in some sense, to our own souls.
Yeah, that worldview effectively strips soul out of the equation by saying, Descartes, I think he's one of a long line. I don't know that he's solely responsible, but let's say, boy, exemplified something with res extensa and res cogitans. Yeah. Cogitans would effectively be spirit, mind, logic. Extensa would be matter, body, physis. And it's, well, if those are the two ways that we distinguish, there's a whole lot that doesn't actually fit into one of those or the other very neat. And the soul perspective tends to get swept under the spirit as saying, well, it's not material. I can't point to a dream, but a dream also isn't altogether rational, logical. I say it's not spirit phenomena. Dreams are soul phenomena. But yeah, that tradition tends to literalize phenomena, seeing them only at the surface and as the surface. It fails to see through the given appearance of a thing. And to your point, it tends to forget that it is one of many fantasies. It lacks a kind of reflexivity.
So what's coming up for me is I read recently about that up until the 1980s, it was widely believed in the medical field, and I don't know how true this is. I haven't gone back and confirmed it through multiple sources, but what I was reading is that it was widely believed that infants actually couldn't meaningfully feel pain because their consciousness had not sufficiently developed. And therefore, it was common practice to perform medical procedures on children without anesthetic. So they would, paralyze a child's limb so that they wouldn't jerk around, and then perform the procedure on them without any anesthetic. And this was happening up into the 1980s. And it came ultimately from Descartes, because Descartes said that animals are pure automatic, that they have no rational or, no essential qualia. There's no interiority to an animal. So he said that we should no more mind the screaming of an animal than the screeching of the gears of a machine. And somehow we came to see a child as essentially an animal, and therefore as just a machine. And somehow the soul, I suppose, develops at some point, and then we can't torture people anymore. But it strikes me as the kind of simplification that becomes available when you apply this very abstracted workshop mentality to the human being.
Mm-hmm.
I want to connect this to my personal experience because, I believe you told me that kind of the primary mode of working with me that we were doing prior to January last year was affect regulation theory.
Influenced by Sylvan Tompkins' affect regulation theory. Primarily, it would be something like Habib Davanlou's intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy, or Ivan Agazarian's work in theory of living human systems.
Yeah.
But those three.
And so your primary kind of thesis was that I had a lot of anger that was suppressed, and that I was very atrophied, let's say, in the capacity to sense my own internal experience of anger. And that because of that, these somaticizing symptoms were popping up: the fatigue, the IBS, and panic attacks. And then the anger was seeping out sideways in various ways, but it was not something that I was easily consciously aware of.
Yeah.
So I had kind of become aware through John Vervaeke of the idea of internal family systems therapy and of somatic therapy and potential for MDMA therapy to deal with complex PTSD. So after my wife and I broke up, I went and stayed at a friend's house for a while. She just happened to be very interested in IFS therapy. She had the book. I started reading the book, and I immediately had an experience of sort of encountering a part that was particularly destructive in my relationship. And so I asked you kind of like, is this something you're familiar with? Would you feel comfortable leading me with this? And you agreed to do that. And at a certain point, I woke up, I think like I very frequently woke up at exactly 3:33 a.m. It wasn't always 3:33, but it was surprisingly often it was 3:33. And one of these nights I woke up and I can't remember if it was a dream or if I was trying to talk to my parts, and I had this vision where I saw myself chopping meat in a butcher room. And I saw these scraps of meat hitting the ground. And when I looked at the scraps of meat on the ground, the scraps of meat turned into shards of a mirror. And each shard of the mirror was a piece of me shining back at me. And I realized that some part of myself was sort of rationalizing myself by trimming away the pieces that weren't usable or workable or pragmatic or useful to experience to me at the time. And then then the vision shifted and I saw myself sort of standing and projecting halos of yellow light, so rings of yellow light out of my forehead. And they were capturing my wife and shoving her into a box, which was like a ladder of boxes. And when I saw that, I had kind of tried to rationalize her and make her essentially tool-like, right? Could I behaviorally condition my wife to give me the outputs that I wanted? And then, that sounds terrible, but that is literally the type of thing that is promoted by the pickup artist community, by various sort of love economics thinking. Even Jordan Peterson, who I respect in many ways, has said something like a really good relationship is about sort of like mutually conditioning each other towards a common end. And there's probably some truth to that, but it's also potentially a dangerous analogy for the way that you think about the person that you devote your life to and yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And then as I kind of expanded from that vision, I saw that in the same sense, it was as if the box that I was trying to put her in, if I opened my eyes to what was above that box, there was another mode of resonating with reality. And in that mode was the spiritual. And by shoving her and myself into these boxes, I had intentionally, or I had adaptively made that area of reality invisible to me. And so that vision comes up for me in thinking about the way in which we apply our ideas or our anthropology of the psyche, how that has very real consequences, right? From how we treat a baby to how we imagine the correct relationship to our own emotions or the emotions of our loved ones.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, that's what we did last year, was essentially we tried to recover those pieces and get them to integrate and to talk well with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious if you would kind of go into how you see the relationship between these different therapeutic modalities and this idea of, do we have a sort of problem of a maimed psyche in some broad sense as a culture?
Oh, yes.
And maybe, yeah. So why don't you run with
Yeah,
that?
I'd love to. Boy. So I would say, working backwards, yes, we suffer profoundly from a psychic mutilation. It's a large part of what the machinery of society produces at this point. Reliably, it produces psychic mutilation. And that's a vivid, evocative phrase, and I hope so. I hope that's an uncomfortable phrase, because it is of profound importance for us. Rip apart the fabric of the sacred. So you asked me to speak a little bit to how these things weave together, because you're right, there were many different stages of the work that we were involved in. Ultimately, I believe that good psychological work is primarily a work of imagination.
Mm-hmm.
There's more that I could say about that, and I will, but for the time being, let's say that many people suffer a failure of imagination. And in the psychoanalytic literature, some of the ideas put forth to account for that failure of imagination are weak ego strength. We could wonder about that, but I would say it's something like, if I'm insecure in my own being, I'm probably not too willing to risk my being in imaginative practice. And I will unconsciously in all likelihood, although consciously perhaps too, I will wall off these possibilities that seem to jeopardize my existence as such. So I would characterize the first major phase of our work together was something like developing the affective capacity that that makes possible genuine imaginative practice. At a later stage in work, we involved psychedelic or MDMA in particular. But we can see that there are distinct stages. There is building affective or emotional regulatory capacity such that a psychedelic experience is available without an exogenous substance. In other words, let's say in that experience you described, you're tripping without taking a substance. And this, I think, is what a lot of people in the blossoming psychedelics communities miss. I'm of the belief that psychedelics are wonderful, the way we typically think of them. I take a substance, MDMA, psilocybin, any number of things. They're a wonderful tool in a psychedelic practice, and yet we can make the most out of them if we are potentiated for a psychedelic experience prior to taking any substance. It's like I want the patient to be able to work their imagery before we introduce substances. And I do this for a particular reason. Jung said that psyche is essentially image. Whatever we mean when we're talking about psyche, it is essentially imagistic. James Hillman, my primary psychological theoretical influence, inverted that. And he said, well, okay, if psyche is image, can we consider image to be psyche? Or in other words, can we take images as souls? And if we take that notion seriously, there's an ethical imperative that when an image comes knocking at the door, if I'm awoken at 3:30 in the morning with this vision, or if I'm groggy-eyed first thing in the morning and I have this fragment of a dream that occurs to me, something has come knocking at the door, and I take images as souls. I have an ethical obligation to meet them as such, to elaborate them, to work with them, to craft them, essentially to love them and invest them with my attention. And what we find is that when we invest images with our attention, when we love images, they love us back. They invest in us as well. And it changes the psychological game to do that.
Yeah, I haven't heard you speak to that idea of the image and the soul and it's very resonant with kind of an IFS type of perspective, but also feels just slightly offset from it. Doesn't map exactly on top, is my sense. I'm struck. What comes up for me looking back is, we would have therapy meetings where I would, like we talk about something, start to kind of invoke a part, close my eyes, and images would populate my mind that were extremely vivid and would create profound sense states, right? Like I would start getting headaches. I would start feeling overheated, right? I was trembling. I'm trying to remember some of the things that I reported to you on the calls, but it was not a kind of logical coherence back and forth game where I shared a narrative, right? It was like, oh, this image is really here and I'm experiencing intense physical symptoms in relationship. When we did that for 6 weeks, you and I were meeting 4 to 6 times a week over that period of time. And then I was also meeting once a week with a somatic therapist, which was also very key in opening the capacity of the body to allow experience. But this idea of loving the image or spirit, one of the things that I've been plagued by for many, many years was obsessive ideation of violence and sexuality. And this was very likely downstream, at least to some degree, of my experiences of sexual abuse and some of the violence that I saw around me. At least the intensity of it is. But it was very hard for me to let go of. And I've been kind of, it's sort of, we've come up and past a year since Beth and I broke up, right? Now we're back together. We passed March 4th, so just a little under a month ago was the anniversary of my MDMA trip. And so as I've kind of like hit some of those, and now we're like looking at kind of when Beth moved out, when she moved back in, all these little experiences that are resonant from last year. What I'm struck by is how easy it feels to be in my mind. Like how there's on rare occasions, I'll sort of have a ghost of some of these images that will rise up, but it doesn't have anything like the same intensity. There's nothing like the same fear of the image that is associated in my mind. It's, oh, okay, that's an old visitor. It doesn't, it'll come, it'll go. I'm not afraid of its presence in some sense. And how much easier that makes it for me to be emotionally available and present with Beth and able to meet her needs and sort of like adaptive to where she's at, because she's really in a place of doing deep, deep healing work for herself. One of the things that you asked me to do back then was to walk all the way through the images, the things that I was terrified of thinking. You said you have to essentially allow yourself to feel everything that is associated with that image to get to the other side. Mm-hmm. And what I discovered on the other side of it was that usually those images were sort of played by my nervous system to escape the effective intensity of emotions, often of love, right? I just like really love my wife, and it rises in me and my psyche's out. We don't have space and time to feel that intensely. So we're just going to put something in front of you to distract you from that. Yeah. And so a lot of times if I feel those things, I will just be like, okay, what am I trying to get away from? What is my mind trying to get me away from? And then it'll relax and release.
Yeah.
So that capacity to entertain the image is very interesting. One of the images that I was thinking about recently. Go ahead. Please go ahead.
Could I just make a comment on entertaining the image? Because you bring up something that mm-hmm. I think is of great importance, and that's that when we're beginning to work imagistically, we will very often encounter images that evoke anxiety or evoke shame. And those are very often signals that we have taken the image literally. And the move with images is to take them seriously, but not literally. If violent ideation, boy, I don't want to stand next to this person on this cliff because I'm afraid I'm going to push them over the edge. If I take that was a big one for me. Literally, if I take it literally that I'm going to push this person over the edge, well, of course that's going to evoke some worry because there are some consequences to doing that. Now, I could take that image seriously without literalizing. And that, I think, is the real practice. Like fleshing out the little details, unfolding all of its implications, dwelling in the image without getting fixated on it.
Yeah. That brings up another question for me, which is one of the things we talked about a little bit was in the internal family systems way of thinking, parts are treated as real, right? The psyche is actually made up of parts. And I had a little bit of hesitation about that as we dove into that kind of work. And I think you replicated it. I always treated my parts with a kind of an agnosticism, right? this arises. This feels like uh, an effective way to work with my psyche, and yet at the same time, reifying it as like there seemed to be a danger in that. I'm curious what your perspective on this idea. So that, you know, there's a, well, let's talk about a couple images. I'll give you a couple examples. So the first image that really came to me when we dove into this was this image of a character that I named Nikub. The name came to me, and I saw it as a figure of a dark, of a sort of a winged human figure, like an angel. It was the image that I saw was actually a drawing of a winged figure. So it was specifically drawn in pencil on paper initially. And the face of this winged angel was sneering and looking down and deeply disdain. And it was a kind of fallen angelic figure. And this Nikub character essentially told me that he had been the force behind that tendency that I had to try to rationalize Beth, to treat her essentially economically, or to condition her to behave in the ways that I wanted, right? And this constant urge that well, not constant, but this little urge that would pop its head into to just offer criticism, right? This little, Beth's very sensitive to criticism, and there was some part of me that always wanted to kind of like cut her down a little, I guess. And that like looking back on fights that we'd had and ways that I treated her, I had this sense that this character in me was predominant during those moments. And I asked him why. And he told me that he essentially wanted to protect me from loving her. Because if I allowed myself to care for her, she would hurt me in the way that I'd been hurt in my childhood. And I asked him, so, you know, what would I need to do for you to take up a different role in me? And he actually said he wanted to become an engine of play in my life. And he told me I needed to go heal the 6-year-old in me and the 12-year-old. So then I went and visited these two characters in me. And then the second image that came to me, essentially after the first MDMA experience, Nikub was basically gone. Like that image was gone. But I had the second character that came in, and I saw a very idealized version of myself as like a 25-year-old man, nude, like crouching in a cave, eating human entrails with blood all over his hands. And he described himself as the wounded self. And and I kind of like, I used to have this persistent curiosity, let's say, about the impact of extreme violence. And the sense of that if I had let's say the gumption to begin to engage in extreme violence, that this would set me free in some sense, that I would exit the world of having obligation and compunction to other human beings. And there was something attractive about that. And yet I always was committed to wanting to love the people in my life. And I was always horrified by this idea of the violence at the same time that there was a curiosity about it. And so I asked this character at some point, why these images? And this was the character who was really dominant in feeding the images to me. And he said, better the pain of total devastation, right? To lose everything and everyone, to know that you are unredeemable, than the anxiety of hope. And so that was kind of the character that I was working with leading up to my second MDMA journey. So yeah, I think that that might be a nice place to illustrate sort of how these images can arise and what is an adaptive way to respond to them and how that relates to this sort of like psychedelic practice versus psychedelic substance.
Yeah, boy. So at the start, maybe I'll say that part of the value of things like IFS or other parts work modalities is they can scaffold our imaginative capacity. They allow
Right.
us to consider ourselves differently. And I do believe that it's somewhat obvious that the soul is polyform. That maybe isn't obvious at first pass, but any of us that spend any amount of time considering dreams or even the fact that we have a slip of the tongue every now and then. Oh, I'm at least two. There is some other within me. How do I imagine
Mhm.
myself from the perspective of an other? And so these modalities can help us. They give us a kind of toolkit for imagining ourselves as a plurality. I do agree with you, sharing the skepticism of the tendency to reify and literalize these. And I think what's really beautiful about the images that you share here is that they exemplify the fact that the images present themselves. They they name themselves. They lay claim to us. And if I go looking for a manager, a firefighter, if I go looking for an inner child, a this, a that, I lose sight of many possibilities of imagining myself. I mean, each of us, I shouldn't say each of us, many of us as children, we imagine ourselves as cops and robbers. We imagine ourselves as dragons or dogs. We imagine ourselves as things beyond the human. And that remains a possibility in our lives into adulthood. These are ways to experience oneself. And so these images that chose you to present themselves to you, they come knocking at the door and they ask for attention. And when you invest their attention, they reveal who they are. They reveal what they want. And when you can engage in a dialogue with them, you will learn not only about you, the person, but about you as a soul, you beyond the confines of an ego constructed out of a lifetime's worth of shame and anxiety. These ways we habitually come to know ourselves. Imaginal practice affords us quite a bit more than might be available to us in everyday waking life. So these images, when they present themselves to us, if they name themselves, it might be worth us asking, what do I call you? This that always makes me pick fights with my spouse. This that always makes me think that I'm a worthless piece of shit. This that always leads me to play video games, distract myself in this, eat too much, whatever. What do I call you? Who among many are you? And what is it that you are asking in this moment? And if we can ask a question like that in good faith, with a willingness to get an answer, and hold a bit of patience, it is remarkable how reliably an answer will present itself to.
Mm. Yeah. Jordan Peterson once said, like, you can pray by just asking, is there something stupid that I'm doing that I could stop doing? That would.
Uh-huh.
That would prevent me from getting from my way. And if you really just quietly listen, your mind will tell you, right? Or spirit will tell you, whatever it is. So I, in the wake of the breakup with my wife last year, I had been kind of flirting on the edges of Christianity for a variety of reasons for a long time. And I had a couple of very intense sort of moments of confrontation with the divine where all of a sudden Christ felt very, very real to me. And it was boom. Okay. I got to listen to this, and this is powerful. This is a path that I have to walk. So I started to pray, and I prayed every night, basically, just a few exceptions, for a year now. And my wife is, she accepted our back into our relationship, and it became this incredible honeymoon. It was the most beautiful period that we've ever had in our marriage, and things have been good. But she's been struggling herself with stuff because her mom got really sick last year, and then her father passed away last year, and then she's had just burnout from working in the tech industry for a long time, and Google's been not the best place to work, and et cetera, et cetera. And so she's kind of got her own habitual patterns of how different parts of her oppress the other parts to make her function in the world, and she can't really live that way anymore. And so she's been trying to figure out how to walk her own path of radical soul recovery. And she told me that, she was sort of envious of my relationship to prayer. She could not believe in Christianity. There's a certain way of interpreting Christianity, at least, which seems very masculine and doesn't have a lot of room for women. And that's hard for her, various reasons. And so she's been like, yeah, I'm really happy for you, and I super enjoy the benefits of having a Christian husband, but I'm not ready to do that myself, right? But she was sort of having a hard time one night and talking to me, and I envy that. And I told her, well, you don't actually have to believe in God to start praying. You could just treat it as some part of your psyche, open up to it and see what happens. So she got down on her knees and started praying, and boom, there he was. Just like talking to her. What the hell? Where are you? What are you doing? Why does this suck so bad? Like fighting with him. And I kind of lost the point that I started with about this story, but this capacity to listen inside and what can arise when we listen inside. That was a very fascinating thing for me. I suppose what I want to say about that is when we listen to these internal things, they can mislead us, and we don't know exactly what we're listening to. And so so Beth basically told me she wanted a divorce on December 29th last year. And I tried to convince her, like there was more that we could do. We hadn't tried this, we hadn't tried that. She was like, oh, I'm really firm in this. And I convinced her to basically take some time to just really listen deeply to herself about it. So she went away for a weekend. And while she was away, like I really was hoping that she would sort of discover her love for me and see that my arguments were good and, et cetera, we could make it work. And I just had this voice inside of me that said, that's not what's going to happen. It was very clear. It was just like, she's going to come back and say that she's done. And there's nothing you can do to change that at this stage. So she came back and said what I expected her to say. And because I had already been told by the voice inside that I was there, I sort of prepared for that. And I was able to handle it well. But then I kind of went back to that voice and I was like, well, you told me what I didn't want to hear and you were right. So maybe I can listen to you. And this voice presented itself as like my gut or my intuition, my deepest intuitive self. And so I asked the voice basically, is there any way that I can get back? And I said, yeah, you can. I said, okay, good. I trust you because you told me it wasn't going to work the first time. So now I'm going to trust you this time. And I was like, well, what do I have to do to get her back? And I said, let her go. Oh, that sucks. I don't want to do that. But he was very insistent. You will not repair your marriage without accepting that it's over. So then the whole time that I was kind of like in the process of the separation, I was always listening to this voice inside. And I knew that it was worth investing some trust in because it didn't tell me what I wanted to hear. And because it told me things that made me more virtuous. Right? When I listened to it, I could see that Beth and our children were happier, and they were better tended to, and they were more secure when I listened to it. And so there was always this sort of check of, these things are working because I am improving in my capacity to relate to the people around me in the way that they need. And that was my way of sort of validating, right? And that was my validation, my justification system for it. So, yeah, I guess I'm curious how to turn that into question here. But when we work with these, how do we identify sort of the voices that have our best interests at heart? Though I suppose in the IFS system, they all have our best interests at heart. They're just using maladaptive systems that aren't actually delivering. How do you think about that process of working with these images in such a way that you are not leading yourself towards delusion?
Boy, that's a good question. Let me take a moment to make sure I can attempt a good answer. How do we not fool ourselves in something like this? I do believe it's important to have some reflective context where we can work these images. If I wanted to set up great conditions to fool myself, I would engage in this, but then not discuss it with any outside other who could reflect this back to me. I think that that's an important check on some of these things, because we can get very swept up in imagery. And there are times where it may lead us astray. Now, there's a question: astray from what? Maybe the thing away from which it is leading me. Maybe I'm very heavily invested in that, but soul is leading me over here. Ultimately, who knows? I think there's a tempting fantasy of certainty that this is in my best interest that I might adhere to, and I don't know how realistic that is. Personally, I'm akin to you in some ways. I think the most important thing about me is that my life is yielded to God. And that became very obvious to me through imagistic practice. And many, many clients will echo something like that, saying that working in this way brings them closer to God. Now, what do they mean by that? Maybe they mean different things by that word. It does start to weave us back into something like the sacred fabric, I'd say. And I know that it's the dead horse that I continue to beat, but I think the way that we most often go astray is when we literalize any of these images, any of these fantasies that they bring forth. If I take any of them as the thing, I've been fooled. The psyche is always seeing through. It's always looking through to what else there is. So whenever I find the, I tread lightly around that word.
Yeah. I have in my prayer practice, I will get answers, right? Be like, okay, I ask Christ a question and I get an answer. But I always treat that answer epistemic humility, right? Because I always think, even if we accept that there is the divine and divine is Christ, it's still my mind through which the thing is speaking. And I'm an imperfect vessel, right? So, maybe that's a good way of making excuses for God, but it seems much safer to me to think, I think I know what that voice is, but I don't know. And I never can know. Perfect. Right? I can only act in relationship to what I receive and watch if it plays out in a life that feels more virtuous. And I judge that to a significant degree in how I see other people around me open. And, I think John Vervaeke's language is really beautiful here. Reciprocal opening. If my opening up towards the divine results in my mode of being helping to open the people around me in a clear way where they're more at ease and have greater access to the parts of themselves and have greater capacity to forgive themselves in some sense in my presence, then I believe that it's working, right? However imperfect. And that's my thought on that.
I agree.
I want to dig into a couple of, I feel like we could go all the way deep into theology here, and I don't want to do that because that's not really what I want the focus of this podcast to be. It's not where I feel
Neither
comfortable.
are wheelhouse.
Yeah. We're both new Christians, right? Both less than a year into our faith here. But what I think, you and I have deep expertise in is this intersection of the somatic movement and therapy, coaching. And I suppose one of the big questions for me right now, as you mentioned, so we can have an imaginal practice, and we can see that an imaginal practice is facilitated through the use of psychedelic substances. Can be properly facilitated through the use of psychedelic substances. When we use psilocybin, we're going to generate imagery in a really hypertrophied way, right? It's the analogy that's popping to my mind. The metaphor here is it's much easier for me to engage in acrobatics on a trampoline, and psilocybin is a sort of imagistic trampoline, which is funny because wasn't it Jung who described psychedelics as a trampoline and spiritual practice as a ladder? Like the psychedelics can get you to see what's on top of the ladder, but you can't stay there unless you build the ladder. So metaphor
I
has
don't
multiple.
know that one.
It's a good metaphor. This metaphor has multiple uses, but there's a sense where like you get an increased capacity to feel deeply into an image. And then what I experienced MDMA as is something like opening up of the capacity to have deep empathy for the parts of myself that were suppressed. And that in that process of empathy, all of a sudden they could discharge. They could allow to be experienced. I was reading about people who've had bad experiences with MDMA therapy. And there's not too many reports of people who've had bad experiences with therapy. But what I read was that generally people who had bad experiences experienced that suddenly they had access to a lot of stored negative emotion that then they did not have support in integrating on the other side of it. And that could leave them left people in 2 years of intense depressive episodes.
Yeah.
And that made sense to me because it was like, oh yeah, like if what you've got under the surface is really beyond your capacity to handle, and you open the door, you're going to have a bad time. Right. And yet at the same time, we ultimately kind of can't move fully adaptively without at some point opening that door. And a lot of these people eventually did have the integration on the other side. It just took 2 years. So the MDMA seems to really act to enhance our capacity to feel what needs to be felt. And so, we can imagine, we can practice that. We can, that was what you were doing with me for the first 2 years that we worked together, was just saying, can you actually pay attention to the experience of anger? Can you actually allow yourself to feel what it feels like? Um, Now, I basically felt like these things were a superpower for me. Like I transformed at a level that was really, really dramatic. And after I'd said this, but so the first time I did it, I came back, and the coop was sort of gone. The second time I did it, I came back, and my wife saw the transformation in me so visibly that by the end of that night, we were back together. And she held my face and said, "I can see the difference. Like, how did this happen?" Right. And that month, so that was in May, I had a big event. I had multiple of my students who'd come up to me, who'd worked with me for years, and said, "You look different. Like, we can see a difference in you." So that was my experience of 2 MDMA sessions at that point. And yet I know people who've done dozens of MDMA sessions recreationally. I know people who've done dozens of psilocybin sessions and who do not seem to have actually extracted most of the healing potential of these things. I wonder even if by using these things recreationally, you potentially remove from your arsenal an extraordinarily powerful healing tool. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this relationship between these medicinal tools and how we use them in a way that actually affords transformation. What are the prerequisites that allow someone to be ready, which you've already kind of dug into? And then what is the cost of treating them as recreational devices in relationship capacity to engage in this deep healing?
Can you repeat the 3 questions? Because I want to make sure I answer each of them.
Sure. I think it's about how do we understand the relationship between or the prerequisites for this practice, and kind of how we get to the actual healing within it. And then what happens when we have used these things extensively recreationally? Like, how does that relate to their, like, what is the danger, or, what is the pathway for somebody who's been disrupted by these or has kind of damaged their ability to utilize it and be impacted in a recreational context? Does that make sense? I think I said it better.
It does. Yeah. Well, I'll take a stab at it. We'll see where we go.
Okay.
I think the recreational use of these things is a great example of the desacralization of our world. We have taken something that, to your point, has tremendous therapeutic potential and have cheapened it. And we've profaned the sacred, perhaps. Now, people can take that as they will. Maybe you still do recreational drugs. Fine, have at it. You make the choice you want to make, and then you deal with the consequences thereof. What I would suggest the prerequisites for these things are, to take the case of the people who have bad experiences with MDMA. Even if we just imagine ourselves as an information processing entity, a psychedelic experience floods you with information. And if you have not built out all of your little circuitry and whatnot, you're going to blow a fuse. And that is a way that we could imagine a bad trip. I really like the idea, the trampoline versus the ladder. Like, psychedelic, the word itself derives from psyche and delos. I mean, it means soul revealing. We are revealing soul, which, again, is essentially image. So psychedelics are a great tool to put someone right into imagistic practice. That can be harrowing, in that if we've not developed our affective capacity and we've not had some practice with images beforehand, we may be confronted with overwhelming shame and anxiety at the face of what then presents itself to us in a psychedelic experience. It's a real shame that the way most manualized approaches to psychedelic treatment the best practices are you have a couple of sessions beforehand to develop setting, set your intention, all of that, and then a couple of sessions afterwards for integration. I think that's a huge missed opportunity. If we front load a psychedelic experience with a lot of work developing affective capacity, we will reap the rewards in a very different way. Earlier you had mentioned we had done 6 weeks of between 4 to 6 sessions a week. Some people might look at that and say, overboard. Who has time for that? What's the point? Well, clearly not overboard, like demonstrably not. Who has time for that? I don't know. Somebody who values their psychological landscape. What's the point? Building a container. Like Jung has this beautiful metaphor in a letter he wrote to someone talking about we're going to experience a spark of divinity. And do we want that to flare up in a house of straw, or do we build a house of stone for this divine spark? So let's take another word often thrown around in the psychedelic circles, the entheogenic. And that has quite a bit to do with this divine occurrence. So for a prerequisite,
generating God internally, right? That's what that etymologically comes down to.
Exactly. So I want to make sure I've got a pretty solid container. If I'm going to generate a God, I want to be able to hold that. I want to be able to apprentice myself to that in devotion without being scorched by it. Boy, so maybe that touches on the prerequisite question. And then in terms of, does that occasion reflections on your end?
Yeah, let's come back. I'm curious about this. You wanted to dig deeper into the question of like, how does this relate to histories of recreational uses of these drugs if someone wants to then use them in the therapy? That's a curiosity. I think where you were about to pick up. So,
yeah. I mean, I have had plenty of recreational drug use prior to deliberate therapeutic use. I'll just say for anyone who has made use of these things recreationally and not therapeutically, you've probably had some good trips, and boy, you don't know what you're missing. Like, I'll say there's a world of difference between good sex and lovemaking. And good sex is great. It is not lovemaking. And until you've experienced the latter, boy, you just don't know what you're missing.
Yeah, that's interesting because one of the things I experienced in the wake of the healing work that I did last year was that when my wife and I reinitiated our sexual relationship, I had psychedelic experiences through sex regularly. Like I would have major emotional releases, tremors, the entire way that I communicate with her in that shifted completely to accessing these deep aspects of the self that aren't so logical and coherent. And, I used to sort of, one of Beth's complaints about me, that's when we broke up was she didn't want to be treated like a sexual science experiment. Because I was always trying to interrogate and understand what works and how to get the right experience. And it just made her feel like, like I'm trying to dissect her experiences, I guess. But in the wake of it, what I noticed was that my ratiocination sort of machinery became far less involved in the actual experience, and it allowed this deep other aspect to me. For folks who are familiar with Ian McGilchrist, fundamentally, I felt like what we did last year sort of just reintegrated the right side of my brain into full persona, which was such a dramatic experience that it kind of feels like the person who I was before that died. And that's been also hard to accept in certain ways. It's been obviously good. And at the same time, it's been so disorienting that there's times when I'm like, did I actually die? Is this a fundamentally different reality that I'm accessing now? And I think that's terrifying, right? And that's one of the ideas that came up for me as far as prerequisites was, I think I read, or you told me, you warned me that I might experience tremors with MDMA.
You and I both have some. Yeah. Sorry.
The look here is, God, I didn't know it would be quite like that.
Well,
I'm
I don't
glad
know
I
if I
warned
told you
you.
I don't know if I ever told you
Yeah.
my first experience with it either, but yeah.
Yeah, you did. You said you tremored for 4 hours too, right? I think it was mostly
What
in your
about six?
jaw. 6.
Well,
Yeah,
no, it
okay.
was bulging.
No.
Yeah, full body.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah. So I think I read, so a friend, the psychedelic therapist, who does not want me to use her actual name publicly, so we're going to call her Jane. She happened to send me an article by, of all people, Tucker Max, about his experience of MDMA. And he also experienced the tremors. And Andrew Huberman also experienced the tremors. But I was reading that apparently only about 3% of people who do MDMA therapy experience tremors. And so it's not necessarily that common, but my sense after it was that it was actually very much like a very important part of the therapeutic effect to actually access the tremors. And that the tremors were available to me because of the degree of embodiment that I had cultivated through parkour, through martial arts, and through somatic practice. That being able to actually trust my body to experience something with great intensity allowed me to mobilize and metabolize emotion in what felt like a profoundly more powerful way. And I was speaking with Zach Stein recently about that. And that's what good trauma release looks like. You have to trim. And my somatic therapist was talking about the idea that grief is an embodied skill, that we habitually inhibit the expression of grief in our culture. And that it's not grief, like it's not an abstracted state. It's not like a word. It's actually a thing that your body does. And the way that your body does it is by having intense sensations in your throat and your jaw and the core of your body. And that if you cannot release into those sensations, you can't actually fully experience the grief. And so this is one of the things that I've been thinking about. And I've been thinking about this in the sense that I'm constantly thinking about the paradox of why you could always argue that why you could so easily argue that we live in the best time in human history and still argue that we live in one of the worst times. Right? We are healthier, or well, not physically healthier, but we are less prone to epidemic disease. We're less likely to get injured. We're less likely to be murdered, etc. And yet our psychological health is very poor in many ways. Our sense of well-being and meaning and all these things is really broken. And one of the things I think is everybody's talking about trauma right now. And I'm like, everybody's been traumatized forever. And I think that what we have is almost less a problem of trauma, but rather a problem of incapacity to digest.
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead if that sparks something for you.
It does, yeah. James Hillman, mentioned him before. He has these beautiful ideas that I think weave together very nicely. He talks about, similar to this, there's trauma all the time. Life is traumatic all the time, everywhere. And he says that the primary issue is one of disordered imagination, an imagination that fails to encompass the past and its traumas. And elsewhere in a book called Dream in the Underworld, he talks about this particular attitude toward dreams and how often in therapy we will turn toward the past. I have to dig up the past. I have to go to the inner child. I have to look backwards and inwards always. And he says the dream is already working to dissolve the patient's remembered past. it is already working at forgetting the past that haunts us. And so rather than continue to invest in this perpetual look back to our remembered past, we could dissolve that in the dream. And I think the way you describe this death of the former self is akin to that. And I have a very similar experience as well. I look back, a few years ago and a handful of years, and I think I came into being only a few years ago. Like the person before that, he was me, he was Chandler Stevens, and yet, by God, like it is altogether different. And we have this cultural preoccupation through pop psychology with the remembered past, and it's frankly not necessary for our psychological well-being. Well-being generally is a squishy phrase, but we're capable of much more transformation than I think we recognize. But we can become very fixated on this historical sense of trauma. Anyway.
So I want to dig into that because I have had tremendous power in some sense to transform myself literally through, I think, re-experiencing the affective load from the remembered that I did not allow at the time. Like if folks want to dig into this, I have a Substack under Rafe Kelley where I go through what these experiences were like. But that first MDMA experience was very much about the past. Like it was an experience predominantly of allowing myself to experience how profoundly affectively dysregulating sexual abuse was to me and in my family. And so those tremors that I described, or I guess we didn't even go into, we kind of got lost before I really said, I tremored violently and screamed for 4 hours while lightning and thunder rolled outside. It was epic. And I ran 6 miles of tremoring and sweated like a dog. And you came into the room and said, it smells like an exorcism. But that was the past, right? I was processing the past, and there was a necessity to process the past, but it was. I have this sense that there's this distinction between sort of like revisiting the past in a way that allows us to metabolize something that was unmetabolized, and revisiting the past as a way to sustain the experience of injury such that we can reify our own status as victims.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's a certain romanticism to being injured. There's a certain way that you can idealize or imagine yourself as interesting, as sexy, as cool, as dramatic, right? Drama.
Drama.
Although
it's more theatric than drama, let's say, in Carton's distinction between the two.
Okay, I'm not familiar, but I think, so I have this worry whenever I see people getting hyper focused on trauma or that sometimes what you're doing is amplifying rather than digesting. You're entering a emotional amplification chamber where you're just bouncing your emotions off of your emotions and they resonate up and up and up instead of actually digesting and calming the system down so that it can now operate from a sense of safety, right? Like ultimately, when I was trying to win my wife back last year, like I was telling her, I think I'm actually ready to offer you a secure, loving attachment. And I think that that you could really use that, and that our children would benefit tremendously by seeing that played out between their parents. And I think that I got there because I was able to recognize that fear and anxiety and shame and disgust were living deep in my sexual psyche. And that when they were undigested and when I ignored the fact that there was distress there, they played out in my marriage. And so I'm curious for your take on, like, how do we walk this balance between the past as something that is necessary to digest and the past as a place to dwell in such that we have an excuse to not be functional in the present?
Yeah, boy. So let's say that memories are a sort of image. They're a sort of image characterized by a temporal quality. They're a sort of image characterized by my agentic participation in them. But a memory is an image. So, as with any good image, again, I think it's important to take them seriously, but not literally. And what I often find in clinical practice is that the therapeutic thing, if I can point to a thing that is therapeutic, is when a person is able to imagine themselves now in a way they could not then and have not since then. A common example, common in that almost everyone will have some conflict with it at some point, is most people cannot imagine themselves as angry. Or not just angry. Most people cannot imagine themselves engaged in sadistic, triumphant celebration over some tortured enemy. However, quite often in cases where someone has experienced trauma, whether that's a ruptured attachment, whether that's some sort of victimization by an other, violent sexual trauma, whatever the case is, that's characterized, the memory, let's say, by an incredible degree of rage toward the other. There is a retaliatory impulse that is natural, is universal when we are hurt by some other. Now, the conflict arises when it is a loved other who hurts us. Then we have this very tense situation wherein I love this person and I hate this person. A difficult thing to tolerate, that ambivalence. So what often happens is one or the other of these will be squashed. I love them and I take on all the bad. Oh, well, fuck me. Or I love me and give them all the bad. Ah, well, fuck you. Forgive the profanity. It exemplifies there. So this feeling of rage is trained out of most of us at an early age. Not all, but most. We learn to suppress it, like grief, like erotic pleasure, like any number of things. And if I can connect with the embodied experience of that rage, occasioned by that memory, the feeling itself, and this I really want to highlight, a lot of people in the somatics, the embodiment community, think the point is just to feel the feelings. I don't think that's right. I think that's mistaken. And I think that leads to this cathartic addiction where people want to get the next big release and big release. The point isn't to feel it. The point, I believe, is to imaginarize it. So if I conjure up a memory that is particularly troubling for me, and I can connect with the feeling that that memory occasions, I am potentiated to imagine differently by this feeling. So let's say I feel this deep rage toward this person who has affronted me in some way, and I connect with the species-wide experience of heat in the abdomen and belly rising up through me, strengthening my arms, mobilizing me for something. What then does this feeling ask for with respect to that situation? If I were to satisfy this feeling, what price does it ask? And quite often, the imagery is violent in response. And it's not just violent, it's sadistically violent. The person takes pleasure in your violence. And that's a very difficult way to imagine ourselves. We tend to fear, we experience this anxiety and this shame in the presence of something like sadistic imagery that says, I'm a monster, how could I even think that? And it's, well, if you were to actually have done that, then maybe we have a conversation about you being a monster. But there is a distinction to be made between thinking or imagining thus and thus. And quite often people fail to distinguish between the two. And therefore they fail to imagine themselves as this. If I can give an example of that. I had this imagery occur to me when I was walking back from a trip out to the desert. And I thought, boy, I could just light this whole hillside on fire and these houses up here too. And I thought, oh, wow. So I entertained the image. I thought, well, that's surprising. But I've got matches with me. I could light the whole thing. And I could just imagine the whole hillside. It's glowing. It's orange. It's scorching heat. The houses are torched. And there was a sense of pleasure in it. There's a kind of potency in that. And the potency was intensified when I realized I can contain this. This is available to me as an option, but I needn't. And I had this tremendous amount of respect for myself as a person who is afforded this monstrous thing and chooses not to engage in it. But it's not that I'm naive to what I'm capable of. I know the horrors of which I'm capable, and I choose other. That, I think, is a really important thing for people to be able to.
Yeah. I think because I was subject to sexual abuse and a witness to sexual abuse as a child, sexuality has been very, tightly wound in me in some sense, I think is the best way to describe it. I felt like very inhibited in certain ways around sex. When I was a young man, very, very afraid to approach women, like really, really awkward and uncomfortable with sort of dance of sexuality and allowing that part of me to step forward. So when I first contemplated doing MDMA therapy, John Vervaeke said, be careful that in the aftermath you don't fall for the penumbra of attraction to other women, right? That there's this potential. So the first time that I went down and met Jane, I don't think I was that concerned about it because I was in this place where I was already processing so much of the sexual trauma that I just was not interested at all. Like my body was not in a place where I was interested. But the second time, it had now been 6 months since I'd had sex, right? And I was definitely worried about what would happen when I was alone in a room with an attractive woman, and I was suddenly under the influence of the extremely powerful drug. And so I registered that, said, let's have a plan for if this altered version of me becomes inappropriate. And sure enough, the moment came when I felt this arisal of desire. But what was very interesting was that I sort of immediately was in this place where I could look at the rising of the desire with the compassion that I had for all the other experiences that I had. And where I used to feel shame or anxiety about that, I all of a sudden, it was like, that's totally natural and is an expression of the very thing that brings me into a relationship with my wife, who I desperately want to love. And there's nothing bad about the attraction or the potential that the attraction points towards, except that it is not in service of this higher good. So it's like, that's not bad. It's good. It's just not good. It's just not as good as the other things that would be sacrificed. And that acceptance of that was so freeing, right? And it was just, whew, like
Oh
that.
yeah.
So much body tension just moved away from me. And I remember sort of laying there and just like years of stored emotion and fear around the kind of the movement within me of my own potential for attraction to women was just much, much easier.
Yeah.
And so that capacity to empathize with the part of you that entertains these images is interesting. I also was thinking about, Christ saying, "Whosoever who looketh upon a woman with lust has already committed adultery in his heart." And so I was thinking about this difference between what does it mean to entertain the image as a way to work through it, as opposed to entertaining the image as a way to attach to it. And I felt that difference. Like when I walk around and I see beautiful women, there's a way in which I can register and appreciate that beauty that feels healthy and wholesome to me. And there's a way in which my mind can begin to attach and to fantasize that feels like it takes my energy away from my primary connection to Beth. And that sort of traps me in a place that's not healthy for me, right? Like it's like this insisted lust sphere that's not actually in relationship to the woman, right? It's in relationship to an image of her, but it's not in relationship to her. It's not in relationship to my wife. And that that feels like a sin to me. It feels unwholesome. So I'm curious for your thoughts on the difference between entertaining these things as ways of accepting and loving the self and moving past their charge and their sort of control in their fear, and versus entertaining them in a way that sort of builds them in you.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to highlight the distinction you drew in that experience you recounted, the distinction being the experience of a feeling and the expression of a feeling. And I want to highlight that because I find that everybody that I have ever worked with, myself included, fails to make this distinction at some point. And someone might say, well, I don't want to be angry, or I don't want to be turned on. So, well, okay. Could you be angry and modulate the expression of anger? Could you be turned on and modulate the expression of your arousal? There's a world of difference between having the embodied experience, allowing yourself to really fill up with the feeling, and then if and in what way you act upon it. A lot of people trip when they fail to make this distinction, and they all trip in the fun way. As for this question of the fantasy, I think it speaks to a capacity to experience the feeling of attraction to somebody. I mean, I walk down to the cafe here and, oh, wow, beautiful woman. Oh, wow, beautiful woman. Oh, beautiful woman. And I might imagine what it would be like to walk up to her. I might imagine more than that. And to your point, when we fixate, and again, boy, when we literalize the fantasy, we can invest in that so much that we really do lose sight of the overall image of our lives. This encounter with a beautiful woman is one image within the overall image of life. You found yourself in a situation where you're on a drug that leads to warm, lovey, ooey gooey feelings in the room with a beautiful, lovable woman. And that,
Well, starved of sex for 6 months.
yeah, while starved with sex for 6 months. Yeah, so, yeah, boy, overdetermined for trouble. And yet, that pained within the broader image you are attempting to realize in your life. You are more invested in this broad image than in this one. And I do believe that it's of great importance for people to reflect upon what am I genuinely after in my life? Because of course I could fixate on, wow, here's a beautiful woman I'm really turned on. People do this with pornography all the time too. But what is the image that I am attempting to realize? To, quote Moshe Feldenkrais, we will act in accordance with our self-image. And if I'm not being deliberate with the image which I would like to bring into fruition, I'm very subject to these little shallow, superficial fixations.
It's an interesting way in which I feel like we've kind of returned to the beginning of the conversation, because I have the sense that the answer to the question is, again, verges on theological, because the proper thing has to do with having a high enough orientation to recognize the ordering of the good, or the ordering of love. Right? I had this when I was on my way to the second MDMA session. There was a beautiful young woman in front of me in line. We were stuck in line for a long time. And she was wearing very tight pants and a very round, attractive. And of course, there was part of my mind that was, man, it's just reach out and squeeze, right? And I had this perspective shift where I jumped into her mind, her perspective. And I thought, what would it be like to be grabbed and to turn around and see this 6'2" scowling, massive, man, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I thought about the idea of, okay, so you could say that there's a kind of love, a kind of desire that comes out of that appreciation of the image of this young woman's butt. And yet, in order to fixate on the fantasy in that way, it actually requires me to objectify her in the sense of not treating her as a fully human person. Because as soon as I can expand my attention away from the attraction of this particular body part to the entirety of her as a human being, I apprehend her in a way that closes down that fantasy in some sense complete, right? And it was kind of the same thing, in the session itself. It was like, here's the image, here's the idea that in some local sense it's not bad, but then here's all of these relationships that are nested, right? The role that she's playing in my healing process and how that needs to be respected and sacralized. The role of her other partner and Beth and everything else, and how all those things order up. And it's like being able to recognize, okay, like I'm not a bad person for being attracted to women's butts and wanting to touch them, right? That's very normal for a heterosexual male, right?
Yeah.
It is not bad to have the desire. It is bad to not order the desire in relationship to the higher order desire of being a loving human being. Right? I think about this idea that there was a day when I said to myself, okay, I don't remember, there was some discussion and maybe there was like an accusation of not being properly feminist enough or whatever. And I was like, I wanted to say, I love women, right? And then I had this moment of, do I love women or am I sexually attracted? Right? And I was like, what would it mean to love women, right? To have an agapic love, to desire the good for women as a whole class of human beings, and to try to have an empathy and understanding of what the experience of walking through the world as a woman is, such that I could lean towards that. And how different that is from, I love women because I like them, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And you could feel shame, you could say, oh, I'm a bad person. It's a sinful thought, et cetera. And I don't, for me, that doesn't feel useful at this stage, right? It seems like it takes me away from the adaptivity and softness, but it's not about It's not about not desiring to me. It's about desiring a higher good. So, yeah, if you want to jump in there, that would be curious.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. Mm. So, boy, what do I make of this? Each of us is, intentionally or not, we are realizing some image of ourselves in the world. And I think this is the real value of an intentional investigation of what kind of future I wish to indwell. Because that future, if I invest seriously in the image of that future, it also has ethical obligations. It also gives me a course of action. And there are certain things that the guy who's dwelling in that future where I want to be, there are things that he doesn't do. So then when I, in the present, am confronted with those things, I then have a choice. Well, am I going to invest in that image, which might mean me suspending some habitual activity? Or am I going to give in to a short-term craving and even if it costs me that image? Now, the challenge for a lot of people, especially in, say, certain addictive processes, people have a hard time with social media, pornography, junk food, zins, vaping, whatever. When you
Video games.
interrupt video games, yeah, totally. When you interrupt that habitual activity, you are inevitably going to be very frustrated. Or you are going to be in this position where you are potentiated to imagine all sorts of things that might be uncomfortable. I worked with a guy for a while who was very intensely addicted to many of these things: zins, video games, swiping on dating apps, all of this stuff. And what we came to discover is that is a great way to distract from grieving the death of your father. Interesting. You can clutter that out of your attention altogether. And when we had this question of, well, what do you genuinely, if you can imagine the best for yourself, or even the minimum criteria for satisfaction of your life in 5 years, 10 years time, what's present then, what's absent then, and just use that as a filter. I say just use that as a filter. It's very difficult because you may be saying no to a lot of things that you are very used to saying yes to, in which case you have a lot of extra time, a lot of extra energy. And that, I find, is it's a ripe context when a person suspends the habit and just imagines from that frustrated place, they will come to imagine themselves very differently. But it is incredibly difficult. And to tie into the theological conversation, maybe let's say, like, for many of us, for you, for I, we have this great model. Can I become more Christ-like? If my life is yielded to God, that gives me an image that I attempt to realize in my concrete actions. That makes it easy for me to know what to say no to. And it makes it much harder to say yes to those things. So, that's where my mind.
The other connection I wanted to make here as we kind of move towards wrapping up is that image that we started with of the scientific workshop removing the human from the cell in some sense, right? The psyche stripped of the soul. And there's a sense as we sort of got to the end here somehow that we were back at that beginning of, in order to, when we strip the self down in that way and we treat ourselves as these operant conditioning boxes, we blind ourselves in some sense to the capacity for that properly higher ordering. And this makes us much more susceptible to the addictive potential of our own drama of social media, of pornography, of sexuality, of food, right? And I think that's what we see in our culture playing out is the loss of meaning and the incapacity to grieve and to feel deeply playing out in these disassociative replacement behaviors across the board. And I think that maybe radical soul recovery is a good way to think about what we need to do to step outside of that process and open up a new potential.
It's certainly a very different way to imagine living our lives.
So, yeah, any final thoughts on the conversation we shared today that you'd like to offer to the audience here?
Boy, yeah, there's plenty. This is rich. I'm excited to go back through and see what else it leads to. For those who are curious, I'd say there's a guideline to imagistic work that I find of tremendous value. Whether it's a dream you're working with, whether it's a recurring situation in your life, whether it's just looking around and going, what the hell? What do I do with the state of geopolitics and the climate, all of this? Who knows? The rule is that everything there is necessary and everything necessary is there. And that can be a tough pill to swallow in some ways, but it can be incredibly fruitful for a continued reflection upon what is it in this situation that is necessary. So, perhaps I'll pause there.
Sounds good. So I mentioned at the beginning, Grounded Founder. Is that your YouTube handle as well? Is it just Chandler Stevens? Where can folks find you? ChandlerStevens.com and on YouTube, Chandler Stevens. So ChandlerStevens.com, Outlier Psychology, anywhere else people should know you're putting work out. It was a pleasure. I feel like there's many, many more deep conversations to come. And thanks for joining me. Thank you, Chandler. Have a good one. Bye-bye.